is that we can learn what it means, what the Bible teaches about leadership. And so we're gonna really start by just kind of asking some questions and thinking through our definition of leadership and how we view leaders, and kind of think that through in our minds presently in the world that we live in, and have that discussion and think about that. And then we're going to dig into what the Bible says and how that language transfers from I hate to even use that phrasing. It's not really us transferring that to the Bible, but it's how there's some distinct differences, or maybe some connections, or where we find leadership in the Bible, and trying to see from the Bible's perspective, what does it mean to be a leader? What does leadership mean? What does that all mean? And then as we define that, we're going to spend some time looking at Jesus, and he being an example of what that biblical definition of leadership is. Then we're going to look at Paul, and then we're going to look at Peter, and I think that'll come month. After that, we're going to start doing character studies, and we're going to go all the way back in Genesis, and we're going to kind of work our way through using what we've learned from this lesson this month to identify biblical leadership characteristics and characters of the Bible, both how they've succeeded and how they have failed. Very important. The Bible gives us both of those. I think that is very, very important. So let's just kind of start off here talking about leadership. Just in your own words, as you're thinking about that word, when that word comes to your mind, how would you define leadership? And that's, I know we're always kind of thinking Bible, and we've grown up in that Bible environment, but just in the world you live in, on a day-to-day basis, either you or how would the world define leadership? Any ideas? Strong people, okay. That's good. Knowledge. Those are. What's that now? Okay. Good deal. Sure. Sure. Okay, so we have strong, okay, we have knowledge, and we have different backgrounds. That's kind of what I gathered. I think those are great starting points. So where do we go from there when we're talking about leadership? How does that define, or how does that relate to what we would call leadership?
Somebody that people are following.
Okay.
And it may be that they're forced to follow them, maybe voluntarily following them, but depending on the context.
Yeah.
But you see, leadership by definition means there's somebody following.
Yes, exactly. By definition, somebody's following. Yeah, that's a great point. I like the way you phrased that. You said either by choice or by force. That's really, really where we're going. It's a good place. Any other thoughts before I move on to my next question? Okay. I think there has been a movement, and maybe you've noticed this. I don't know exactly when it started. I probably could look back. But a lot of times when people think about, in the business world, CEOs, managers, whatever, the boss, when you think about those terms, there was a time when that was just the way things were. There's a CEO, there's a manager, there's a boss. You don't really consider them, would not use the term leader, that's not really where they are, but we would think, well, they're in charge, right? And I kind of think back on my experiences with, I've worked with 2 Jewish families in my lifetime, and one in Maryland and one in Alabama. And let me tell you something, with those families, there was no such thing as leadership, as we would sometimes call it, in the sense that they were leading anybody. There was very much, the owner of the company was the CEO, was the manager, was the boss, because that's how they tend to function. They didn't really like to delegate things, unless they had a son, and then they would delegate. But nonetheless, that culture was in charge. And guess what you did? You listened, no matter what. And since they owned the company, and they managed the company, and they had full control over the company, now just kind of give you an idea of how this looks, painting a picture of this, it was a company in Maryland, and it was, I don't know how much money they pushed to that company, but it was a tremendous amount of money. The original owner of that company would take a paid receipt and he would bite the corner off and put it in a stack. Okay, now he did that from the time that company was a baby company, a little pawn shop downtown DC, to the time when it became a multi-million-dollar international company. He would bite the corner off a paid receipt and that's how he kept his books. So there was something about that mindset that said, this is who I am. I'm not going to change. And there wasn't a choice of following. You either worked for him or you didn't. And so there was no effort on his part for leadership. Now, I have worked with companies who they wanted you to look at them, not just as the boss, but somebody worthy of following. So I don't know when that transition took place in our culture, but we see people being trained as managers to say, instead of just lording over your employees, you need to be someone they want to follow. Does that make sense? And that's where my thinking is kind of going, the difference between those two ideas. Being an owner or a manager who lords over somebody, or being somebody that people want to willingly follow. Have y'all had that experience? Y'all kind of seen that, or am I the only one? No, we're kind of in the same page there. So for a person who is leading a company or a business, here's a question that I think is vitally important, whether manager, CEO, whatever. If they're leading, using that term leadership, if they're leading the company, if they're leading their employees, what do you think the end goal, where are they leading them? What's the end goal of that position of leadership in a company setting? What do you think? Oh, that's good. Yeah, show a profit. Yeah, that's really what they want, right? With you or without you. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Keep the company going. Okay, that's very good. And if they have somebody above them, where do you think that middle management, where do you think their leadership is leading people? So you think about it, being a manager and having somebody over you that you're accountable to, and then you're managing the group of people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, say it again. Right. Oh, yes, succession. I got you. Absolutely. How about the relationship between those groups? You have your employees, you have your middle management, you have your upper management. In regards to, we've already talked about a lot of times with companies, that's really the concern, is profit, business success, health, how well is the business going? That's really the end goal. They're not really necessarily leading you to something greater. They're not necessarily leading you to a better person. But their end goal is to make sure they meet those major criteria, the profit, the business running successfully. That kind of an idea.
Everyone in a leadership role, from my experience, all they want to hear is just
Oh, okay. Gotcha. There you go. Yes, sir. Absolutely. That's a good point.
they might actually take your comments and consideration
Sure.
and ideas, but at the end of the day, they want to hear yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. At the end of the day.
And the huge corporations
Yes.
don't.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense. And I have seen that with not huge corporations, but a lot of the music stores I've worked for that had other stores. It was kind of a bigger company size. They would, I remember getting I forgot the guy's name now. I remember getting a Christmas card and a birthday card from the owner of the company that I worked for. Now, he had like 21, 30 stores across the country, but he would send all of his employees a Christmas card, and it was hand-signed, okay? Now, it wasn't hand-signed. He had them all printed that way. But he did it to make it feel more personal. What do you think his goal was in that? Do you think he was trying to make personal relation? Do you really think he really cared? Do you think he knew who I was? Probably didn't have any idea who I was. But then again, we see that. So we have, and the reason I'm bringing this up, because we can all relate to this, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because we in this world that we live in, the culture we live in, we can relate to employee, manager type relationships. We can relate to people using terms like leader in that environment, and I think it's a way to soften the blow. You know, it's kind of like, well, he's not your manager, he's your leader. Oh, really? Okay. You know, he's not the CEO, he's the leader. And somehow that's supposed to change our mindset in relationship, but sometimes it doesn't change anything, right? Is it possible for a manager to be a good leader of people where they really are concerned about the person over profit? Is that possible? Sure, I think it's possible. It's not always the case, but it's possible. But a lot of times what we know is that if you're hyper concerned about the person and not concerned about the bottom line or the profit, what generally suffers in that situation? Yeah. I don't know if there's a great balance for that, okay? There's got to be some priorities. So everybody has a priority. Everybody has a goal. Everybody has a reason for leading. There's a reason for their position. I think a lot of things that were said already are great. Let's expand that, okay? Now that we've kind of unpacked that a little bit. What about nations? What about countries? What about people like that? When we're talking about leadership in those environments, what are we talking about? What kind of positions of leadership are there in your mind? What's the first one that comes to mind? Not the first term that comes to mind, the first person that comes to mind. The first seat of leadership that you think about in a nation. Where do you think? President, yeah. In our country, that's what we think about. All right. Are there any others? Kings, queens. We've been hearing a lot about that recently, you know, with Queen of England passing. Anything else? Emperors, right? As we think biblically, we think of emperors. Yes, Shaws. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's a good one. I didn't think let's come up with that one. But we have leaders of nations, leaders of countries, leaders of places like that. And we have questions, right? Where are they leading the nation? Where are they leading the people? What's their goal in their leadership? You know, what's their purpose? And so let's park on that one for just a minute. When we're talking about the presidency, okay, we'll start there. What do you think the goal of most presidents are? What's their main goal? I mean, mentally, not their actual position goal, because we have that kind of written down. This is what the president's supposed to do. But when a president takes office and they've made all the promises and they've been voted into that position of authority, what do you really think their goal is? Money? Okay, that's it. Jack goes right to the money. Okay. Anything else? Unite the country. Yeah, it should be a goal. I'm just thinking, is that always the goal of people? Go ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, yes. Yeah. Right, how they will be viewed in the future. Right, I think that's a big one. I think that's a big one. And you're really into presidents too, right? That was kind of your thing. Yes, okay. I know Joe told us about that before. Be reelected. Okay. Johnny, you had that was okay? Okay, you got that. Yeah.
Most of their deals are so full of themselves that this won't be remembered throughout the rest of eternity.
Right.
But that does not make a good leader. You know?
Now, and I will preface this. Go ahead.
You said you got a Christmas card from the,
Yes.
I get, and I got again this year, a Christmas card from Ted Cruz.
Oh, you did?
And I'm pretty sure that he's not real concerned about me having a good Christmas. But I do think he'd like me to vote for him.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah. I got a letter from the president one time. That was a lot of fun when I was in the military. It was not signed personally by him, I can assure you that. Greetings. Yes. You're hereby, yes. Been there, done that. But you know, the whole idea is, and here's the thing, and I just want to make sure we're clear on this, there is a presidency in our country in which we expect the person who is holding that office to have a certain goal. What is our expectation of that office? Run the country, not into the ground, but right, run the country well, right? So we have an office that has been put in place by people who are a lot smarter than I am, and they have a goal or an agenda for a particular office. The weak link in that system is the fact that people tend to hold the office. And we've just acknowledged the fact that sometimes people they don't have that goal in mind. They have other goals. They have other agendas.
You realize that we talked about the expectations of the president.
Oh, we'll get there. We will get there. I'm establishing this baseline, okay? All right, so what about other things? We have kings, right? And then we have emperors. We've already talked about those. So here's the thing. Bosses, managers, presidents, kings, emperors. There are a couple of ideas, positions, and there are positions, right? Presidencies, the kingship being an emperor. And there's authority, okay? And that term authority is really important. And when we're talking about biblical leadership, that's the term that we are going to see constantly and continually. Now, I don't know if you've ever done a word search for leaders, and unless you search the NIV, you will not find the word leader or leadership. But guess what word you will find? Authority. A lot of times, that's how the Bible defines leadership, is by authority. In our country, who decides who the leader is? Yes. Yes, that's the process, okay? The people decide who they will be led by, okay? With the expectation that person, well, with the exception, of course, that there's kings, right? And in the kingship, usually what's the defining factor there? Handed down to him, right? So it's a little bit different, but we live in a country where we elect. So as the people go, and we've always talked about this, the morals of a country, the morals of those people, how they tend to be, do you think that a group of people who are ungodly are going to want a godly president? No, and that tends to be the problem, I guess, with that system. The more our country leans further and further away from God, then guess what kind of president the majority of our country is going to want to put into office? And that tends to be the case. I mean, that's why it's such an important topic. Here's some things. Let's talk about this. Paul talks about leadership. Now, this isn't Paul's lesson that we're going to do in a few weeks, but I do want to allow him to define leadership for us. Talking about nations is a lot different than talking about the manager at Dairy Queen, right? Wouldn't you agree? Big time difference. So let's see what Paul says. This is Romans chapter 13. If you want to turn there, we'll spend a little time in Romans. And I want to come up with some words. There's two words that are very important when we're talking about leadership in the Bible, and they'll help us define leadership. And we're going to start with nations. Okay, this is Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. Very important aspects of this. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those which exist are established by who? Okay, all right, so, and we can really take the word leader or leadership and place it where authority is, and that would be the same thing. The idea is that when we're talking about governments, when we're talking about places of power, whether it's kingdoms or whether it's empires or whether it's presidencies or whatever, does God care about a group of people being governed? Just going to leave it there. Does God care about a group of people being governed or led? Yeah. In fact, I think that's what Paul's talking about. Now, what government would Paul be referring to in context? What do you think? The Romans, right? Yeah, the Romans. You had something, Joe? No. Now, knowing what we do about the Romans, were they always good leaders? Well, okay, yeah. Yeah, things changed for them, obviously, but nonetheless, Paul is saying to a group of Christians who are living in Rome, who are under the lordship of Jesus, that this is how they are to conduct themselves with governing bodies, right? And in other words, the governing body serves a purpose in God's world. The governing body serves a purpose in God's world. That doesn't always mean that the person sitting in that place of leadership is godly, but it does mean that the system itself is God's purpose. God wants people to be governed. And we can contrast that with Israel, right? Israel was a nation. We can talk about that in a minute. But nonetheless, we're a nation within a nation, and God has established authority. We also know that with our government, the people choose the leader. That's our government. And what kind of leader they choose is going to really reflect the kind of people that we are. That's very much the case in most situations. Okay, so here's some key elements. Authority, we're talking about leadership, biblical leadership. Authority, and what do you think the other word is? What's the other half of that? You have somebody who's in authority, and what's the other half? They're in submission. When we're talking about biblical leadership, that's what we're talking about. Authority and submission. Those are going to be two key words that come up over and over and over again. Authority and submission. Now let's look at some more of that passage. Look at verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinances of who? Of God. And they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. This is the whole concept of God's idea of a system of governing power, is that they're going to reward and punish the evil and the good and the evil. He says, do you want to have no fear of authority? Do you want to have no fear of leadership? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God for you for what? Good. Now, we can talk about that all day long. Is it always good? Do we always see good coming from kingdoms, empires? Not always. But that doesn't change the fact that it is originally purposed for that. God has established it. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection. Subjection to who? Authority, right? Those are our key words. Okay? Not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to the very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. It's just an interesting thing. And I'm just trying to get us to see this is where we have to begin. Before we can even look at the Bible, what God says to his people in regards to he governing them over Israel in that system, before we can look at Jesus and how he works that into his system, before we can talk about Paul, before we can talk about Peter's leadership, this is where we need to begin. Okay, here's another, 1 Peter chapter 2. This goes from governments to slavery. We don't really have that as much in the United States, hopefully none, but I'm sure there's some places in the world where this still is the case. Very much the case in their culture. And the Bible has something to say to servants. Now, this is 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 and 20. Now, listen. Listen to our key words. Servants, be what? Submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, because we would be okay with that, right? You know, if we had a master, we would be very much okay with being submissive to a master who was good and gentle, right? I don't think we would have a problem with that. But also to those who are what? Unreasonable, okay? Unreasonable. For this finds favor, for if for the sake of conscience towards God, a person bears up under sorrow when suffering unjustly, for what credit is there for if, when you sin, you are harshly treated, you endure it with patience, but if you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure, this finds favor with God. So in other words, it doesn't matter what kind of leadership you're under. If you are under the leadership of a master and you're a servant in this circumstance and you're a Christian, what's your responsibility? What's your responsibility as a servant? Submissiveness to authority. Whether that leadership is good or whether the leadership is bad. Whether it's just or unjust. Now, Peter's point is, if you are under just a horrible leader, and they are just treating you like dirt, and you turn around and you just pay back what they deserve, and you just do everything you can to get their goat and kind of stir up trouble and sin and make trouble for them, in other words, you get what you deserve, okay? But if you do good and you do right in spite of whatever, poor leadership, poor authority, how does God see that? When you patiently endure injustice or injustice, how does God view that? Yeah, it's favorable to God. It's favorable to God. But then again, those are our key words, authority and submission. Now here's a key one. This is Paul, Ephesians chapter 6. Paul says this, it's really good. He says, slaves, be obedient to those who are masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart, as to who? What does it say? Ephesians 6, Christ. That's incredible, isn't it? I mean, I couldn't imagine that whole scenario, honestly, but it does strike me as amazing. Not by way of eye service or men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ. Now, granted, they're slaves of somebody else, but they recognize Christ as their ultimate authority. Doing the will of God from the heart, with goodwill, render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. Now, verse 9 is important. Masters, okay? So not only does the Bible speak to the servant who has a master, who has a leader of the flesh, but also to the one in authority. Do you think that's true with what Paul said about governments? Yes, it's directed to the Christian under the government, but do you think that message should speak to the governing authorities as well? What do you think that message should say to the governing authorities? What kind of message did Paul send to Rome inadvertently as he was speaking to Christians?
What you just read said that he was telling the governing authorities to essentially administer justice, to punish the evil,
Yeah.
praise the wicked.
No, yes. Right.
The wicked we praise, and we praise the, unfortunately we do this.
Yes. Get those mixed up sometimes. Yeah.
It's a message to government that that's how you administer justice.
Yes. Right. That ultimately, and here, let's read this first before I make this comment. Masters, do not do the same things to them and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is where? See, therein lies the key. And there is no what? Partiality with him. Okay, so let's kind of unpack this a little bit. So the person who has authority is the leader. That's how the Bible defines leadership. Whether it's a king, whether it's a president, whether it's a master, whether it's Jesus, who obviously had authority, whether it's Paul, who had authority, Peter. We'll go and talk about those later. We don't talk about this, didn't talk about this in this lesson per se, but other parts of that same text talk about husbands of the family, right? In a family relationship between a husband and a wife, who has been given by God from heaven the authority in that family unit? Right, so that has been given. It's a from heaven down type approach. Nobody just came up and said, hey, husband, you're the leader. Congratulations. God says, husband, you're the leader. Here's a responsibility. What about mother and child relationship? Who's the leader in that family? Rather be the mother. Not always the case, right? So then we have authority, and we have what? What are our key words? Authority and submission. That's how that leadership role works. What about the elders of a church? You know, who ultimately gives the elders their position? Do we just elect people we really like? Is that how it works? Like, the presidency, we just kind of say, yeah, let's vote and put somebody in that position that's going to champion our personal agenda? Is that how we do it? Do we have any kind of guidelines for finding godly elders? Sure, of course. So where does that leadership role come from? It comes from God, right? And so what do we have there? We have a leader who has authority. Who has given that leader authority? God. And what is our responsibility? Our key word. Submission. Okay, we'll talk more about that because there's more that the Bible actually directly addresses that, but we're going to spend some time on that later. But in all these examples, where does the actual authority come from? In all of these examples we just gave? God. How would you like to go to one of the Caesars and say, hey, guess what, buddy? God gave you your authority. How do you think that would go? He'd probably say, well, which God, right? Oh, no, the God of heaven, the only God. That would be tough, right? Or even to Pharaoh. When Moses approaches Pharaoh and he says, your God, my God, who is everybody's God, he gave you this position of authority, and then he is speaking through me to communicate to you. We can just go on and on. The point is, the authority comes from the top down, right? From the top down. In our society, in business, in government, how do people normally see that progression? Who normally appoints managers? Who normally appoints bosses? Who chooses the president? By voting, right? I mean, but that's our mindset, right? We have this mindset that leadership comes from us, that direction. We choose our leaders. We say, in some cases we do, but my point is this. We're so ingrained in that idea that I choose who I follow. I choose who leads me. I choose who is in control. But in the biblical language, it is always coming from one place. And where is that? It is coming from God, always. No matter how high up the chain, it is always, whether that person realizes it or not, it always comes from God. That's where it begins. And I believe that's where we need to focus as well. It begins with God bestowing leadership. But it also is submitting, and that's part of God's plan as well. Those who are under an authority must submit, even if the authority is not good. And the reason we submit is because ultimately, who is our authority? It's God, right? And that's how we talk about governments. That's how we talk about slave-master relationships. That's how we talk about all things. In the end, God is the ultimate authority. Now, there's probably a lot of things that we can talk about, and I'm sure Greg's probably thinking of a lot of ways in which we can say, okay, yes, if they're leading us away from God, if they're doing this, we have to, but we're just talking about the basic principles of leadership, basic principles of biblical leadership. So the framework for understanding biblical leadership is this. It begins with authority and submitting to authority, or who is the leader and who is being led. That's where it begins. And this may seem very different than what we see in the world today, especially the way people like to present themselves. And this comes up in the Bible too. How often do we see people who do things, say things, have things, wear things, whatever, whatever they can possibly do to draw people to them and for them to follow, and they do things in order to encourage people to follow? How often do we see that? All the time. All the time. People will say things that people want to hear. They'll do things that people want to do. They will allow things that people would like to have freedom to do. And the more somebody kind of pulls and people look at them and they say, yes, that's the person I want to follow. Why? Why do they want to follow that person? Yes. Personal gain. Personal gain. When God puts a person in authority, why do we follow that person? Is it because we think they're awesome? Is it because we want something out of them? Is it personal gain? Is that the reason? I'm sorry? Yeah, because we recognize that God puts that person in authority. And it's very different. And this is really how a lot of people in the first century thought. When they elected an emperor or brought an emperor into power, people followed the emperor. Whenever they brought a king into power, people followed the king. Okay, real quick, some Old Testament examples. We won't have a whole lot of time to talk about this, but this is from 1 Samuel chapter 8. This is something that goes on throughout the whole Bible, and so we'll be able to build a lot on this as we move along. Of course, we know Samuel, right? And Samuel had his sons. This is 1 Samuel chapter 8. Who were Samuel's sons? Anybody remember? Nobody remembers? Okay, I'll let you get there. 1 Samuel chapter 8. What was the name of his first son? Joel. What was the name of his second son? Abijah. That's right. Yeah, Joel and Abijah. And they were... And now, if you have an NIV version, it says they were leaders in Bathsheba. But if you have the New American Standard, King James, what does it say? Judges. That's what that word means. Judges were leaders of the people. Now, did his sons walk in the ways of the Lord? No. No, in fact, so much against that the people complained about it. And they go to Samuel, which they respected. And they even say, Samuel, your sons, they're awful. They're doing horrible things. They're terrible judges. And what do they ask for? A king. A king. Now, God had already said that they would ask for a king. You can go back and read Deuteronomy and see that God's intention was for that. But the fact that they're kind of looking at this system, they're seeing it fail, they're seeing poor leadership coming up, and they know Samuel, they trust Samuel, but he's getting old. They already said that, Samuel, you're getting old, and Samuel's like, thanks, really wanted to hear that. And your sons are horrible, and so we need something else. And so instead of waiting for God to appoint some leadership, what do? They step in and they say, Samuel, what? Give us leadership. We will take it, right? We want a king. And so, but we know that this wasn't good because Samuel is very distressed by this. But then he speaks to the Lord, and the Lord says, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, Samuel. So this isn't a stain on you. This isn't about you, and you've done well. But who have they rejected? God. From being what? King or leader, authority, having authority over them. So we see that they're making this very common and very realistic transition from submissiveness to God as king in his system and his giving of authority, and they're making this transition to say, no, we want a king. We want to take a king for ourselves. So Samuel spoke all the words to the Lord. This is in verse 10, who had asked of him the king, right? And he said, this will be the procedure of the king. Okay, now this is going to pay attention to this for a minute, because then again, authority and what? That's God's leadership, right? That's how biblical leadership works. And here they were asking for a leader, a king, and to be like other nations is ultimately what they desire. And he says, and the king will reign over you. Now listen, he will take your sons and place them for himself in the chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. That's not good to be chariot runner before the king. He will appoint for himself commanders and thousands of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed in your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flock, and you yourselves will become his servants. You will cry out in that day because of your king, your leader, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you that day. What if a president got up, a potential president got up, and said those very words? Who would vote for him? Who wants that? Right? I mean, this doesn't make any sense. But look what it says. Nevertheless, what did the people do? Who was Samuel? Was he not the leader? Was he not trying to lead godly? Was he not trying to help the people? Was he not trying to top-down leadership for the people? And he says, this is what's going to happen to you. If you choose this route, if you choose this leader, if you decide to submit to this kind of leader, this is what's going to happen. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, which means what? What does that translate to? That's right. It's exactly right. Refuse to listen to the voice of Samuel is equivalent to refusing to listen to the voice of God. And they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, and that we also may be like other nations, and our king may judge us and lead us, and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated to them in the Lord's hearing. Still didn't work. And the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice and appoint them a king. It's kind of a sad story. Anticipated, yes. But it speaks so much about what God has in store, what God has planned, and how important submission is to the understanding of leadership. Right? And well, then again, I keep saying this, but we're going to talk more about this because Jesus is going to amplify this. He's going to amplify this. If you cannot submit, if you cannot be a servant, if you cannot submit to authority, if you cannot submit to a person to the extent of what did Jesus do, what kind of things did Jesus do? What comes to mind about Jesus and his humility? Washing feet, right? If you can't do that, right? If you can't submit to authority, then you've missed the entire point of biblical leadership, right? Now, then again, we'll expand on this later. And so I'll just kind of stop there for that moment. We'll talk about this when we get to Jesus and what he has to say about authority and leadership. But I want to make these few comments real quick. God expects submission to those who are in authority. So that idea of authority and submission is key to understand biblical leadership. And then we'll spend some time just unpacking that. What does that look like? How is that done? Has it ever been done well? Have the people ever submitted? Have there ever been good leaders? And what does Jesus have to say about authority? What does he demand of us? And so we'll next week we'll talk about that. Any thoughts? You got 2 minutes. Any thoughts or questions? All right. Look forward to this. It's going to be really good. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll close this lesson. Let's pray together. Father, we are so grateful for everything that you do. We recognize your ultimate authority. Father, we sometimes don't understand what happens in this world, and sometimes we don't understand the leaders that are in positions of authority. And we do understand, however, Father, that whatever happens on this earth, you are the one who is ultimately in control. And submitting to those who are in authority is submitting to you. And we're just so incredibly thankful that we have the opportunity to be led by you and submit to you, to submit to your Son. Father, thank you for all that you have blessed us with. Help us to understand and be good servants. And those of us who are called to be leaders, help us to be good leaders, Father. Thank you for all that you have blessed us with. Thank you for your Son, and it's in his name we pray. Amen.